Hello, welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Here are the headlines. The White House says Russia is plotting to annex more Ukrainian territory. Ukraine's First Lady, Alina Sneger, set to address the U.S. Congress today. While Russian President Vladimir Putin says Ukraine did not make good on preliminary peace deal. A warm welcome once again. The White House says Russia is laying groundwork for the annexation of Ukrainian territory and is installing illegitimate proxy officials in areas there under its control, as it seeks to exert total control of its gains in the east. This was informed by Chief National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. He told the White House briefing that the Russians are preparing to install proxy officials, establish the ruble as the default currency, and force residents to apply for citizenship. Kirby says this is the same tactic that was used in 2014 when Russia announced its annexation of Crimea after taking control of it from Ukraine. The international community considers Crimea's annexation illegitimate.
Already Russia. We have information today, including from downgraded intelligence, that we're able to share with you about how Russia is laying the groundwork to annex Ukrainian territory that it controls, in direct violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. We are seeing ample evidence in the intelligence and in the public domain that Russia intends to try to annex additional Ukrainian territory. Russia is beginning to roll out a version of what you could call an annexation playbook, very similar to the one we saw in 2014. Already, Russia is installing illegitimate proxy officials in the areas of Ukraine that are under its control. And we know their next moves. First, these proxy officials will arrange sham referenda on joining Russia. Then, Russia will use those sham referenda as a basis to try to claim annexation of sovereign Ukrainian territory. The Kremlin has not disclosed a timeline for the referenda, but Russian proxies in these territories claim they will take place later this year, possibly in conjunction with Russia's September regional elections. So what are the implications? At the start of the year, Russia told the world that it was not planning to invade Ukraine, and now we're expected to believe that they're not going to plan to annex Ukrainian territory. Annexation by force would be a gross violation of the UN Charter, and we will not allow it to go unchallenged or unpunished. We will continue to provide Ukraine with historic levels of security assistance. Later this week, the administration will announce the next presidential drawdown package of weapons and equipment for Ukraine. It will be the 16th such drawdown to support Ukraine since the president took office. Now, I'll let Mr. Putin speak for why he decided to go at this particular time, but I would say three things about this trip. One, it shows the degree to which Mr. Putin and Russia are increasingly isolated. Now they have to turn to Iran for help. Two, it shows the degree to which his own defense industrial base is having a hard time keeping up with his unprovoked war in Ukraine. We already know that in respect to precision-guided munitions and advanced systems, like tanks, even aircraft, he's having trouble, particularly with the microelectronics because of the sanctions and export controls. And we already know that even without that, his defense industrial base is challenged because of the rate of operation, the pace of operations in Ukraine. And then the third thing I think this indicates is the degree to which he has absolutely no intention of stopping the war and sitting down in good faith and negotiated settlement with Mr. Zelensky. He has every intention, quite the contrary, because now he wants to go buy several hundred UAVs to continue to prosecute this illegal war and to continue to kill Ukrainians.
House Presidents Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden both welcomed Ukraine's First Lady Alina Sneger for a visit ahead of her address to Congress today. Zelensky embraced Jill Biden and received a bouquet of flowers from President Joe Biden, who met her vehicle outside. Afterwards, the two women and delegations from both countries sat down for a meeting in the White House Blue Room. Jill Biden had made a surprise visit to Ukraine, which Russia invaded earlier this year. In May, visiting visiting her counterparts in a school who was sheltering displaced Ukrainians. When she came back, she said she had spoken to her team about helping address mental health issues for mothers and children who have suffered atrocities. Prior to her White House visit, Zelensky accepted a Human Rights Award on behalf of Ukraine from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington.
So nice to see you again since I last saw you. Gosh, Mother's Day was what, May 8th? And, you know, I think when I came back, one of the things that I said was, you cannot go into a war zone and come back and not feel the sorrow and the pain of the people that I met. And you introduced me to so many refugees, the mothers and the children, and we spent some time with them. And so I know you're here. You asked me then to talk about mental health issues. And so I came back and I talked to my team, and I think you received my letter about what we're doing to help with mental health for the mothers and the children who have really, you know, suffered such tragedy and the atrocities. And so I've been working on it. The team has been working on it.
Meanwhile, President Biden on Tuesday signed an executive order aimed at deterring and punishing wrongful detention of U.S. citizens abroad by authorizing government agencies to impose sanctions and other measures. A move came amid growing pressure on Biden from families of hostages and detainees, most recently on the case of WNBA star Brittany Griner, who's being held in Russia since February and is on trial on drug charges. But some families said the order achieved little in concrete terms. They lambasted the administration for not allowing them to ask questions during Monday's video call previewing action, while saying Washington still lacked a solid strategy on how to bring their loved ones home. A plight of American detainees has gained visibility after Griner's arrest and the recent release of former U.S. Marine Trevor Reed in a prisoner swap with Russia at a time when U.S. relations with Moscow are at their worst in decades over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. does not provide an official figure for how many U.S. citizens are detained abroad, but the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation has named after American journalist abducted and killed in Syria, says more than 60 U.S. citizens are wrongfully detained in about 18 countries.
Are focused on these cases and in constant touch with his national security team and with our special presidential envoy for hostage affairs on all these cases, including, of course, Mr. Whalen and Mrs. Griner.
I want to tell the world that I'm a victim of political kidnap and ransom. There's obviously no credibility to this situation. This is retaliation for sanctions. There is absolutely no legitimacy.
The average detention time now is going near 5 years. These are not people who've been held for a few months. These are people who've been held for many years, true political prisoners in most cases. So it's an urgent problem. I'm just so afraid that they will die in captivity, that they will be forgotten.
One of many scary things, but one of them is this feeling that we have that, you know, Ahmaud will be forgotten. And I know for Ahmaud, one of his biggest fears is being forgotten, and that's a common thing we hear from other hostage families and their detainees. You know, this will make sure that no one in Washington, D.C. forgets about them.
Well, scrutiny continues by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on his government personnel as he says he's dismissed a deputy head of the Domestic Security Service, the SBU, and appointed a number of new regional heads of the security outfit. Over the last couple of days, President Zelensky has fired the SBU chief, Ivan Bakanov, and the country's prosecutor general. Their dismissal was confirmed by a comfortable majority in Parliament yesterday. In a statement published on Telegram minutes before his dismissal was confirmed, Bakanov said miscalculations had been made during his tenure, but that he was proud of his record. The head of Zelensky's political faction said Irina Venediktova, the chief prosecutor, the prosecutor general, had been voted out as prosecutor general. Now, after the vote, ruling parliamentary party leader and close Zelensky ally David Arakamia wrote on Telegram that Venediktova remains in the team and implied that she was due for a diplomatic posting. During his nightly address, President Zelensky said the past 24 hours had seen a lot of dead and a lot of wounded after Russian strikes in a number of regions in the east of the country.
The reshuffle of the power vertical is ongoing. Today, I appointed new heads of regional departments of security service of Ukraine in Zakarpattia, Poltava, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions. I dismissed one of the deputies of the head of the SBU. I am grateful the members of the contest panel for the selection of the special anti-corruption attorney have finalized their results. The decision on the winner is confirmed. During the last 24 hours, we were also hit by a Russian strike in Nikopol and other settlements in the Kharkiv region, Mykolaiv. Kramatorsk, a cruise missile simply hit the town center there, Toretsk, Slovansk, Toretsk, and other towns in the Donbas. A lot of dead, a lot of wounded. The occupiers hit at the border areas of Sumy region, in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been taken over in Enegoda, a satellite town to the plant. There are new facts of terror against the personnel and the local residents. No matter how well the occupiers would hide our armed forces, our reconnaissance units will guarantee retaliation, and our state will determine the identities of all Russian criminals who are guilty of terror against Ukrainians. And I expect from this visit of the First Lady meaningful results in Ukraine's cooperation with the United States. Right now, this is very important. The meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, USAID Administrator, Samantha Powers, and other influential women politicians who represent America's government and parliamentary agencies have already taken place. Ukraine's First Lady, Alina Sneger, will address the U.S. Congress, representing all Ukrainian mothers and all Ukrainian women, and it will be an important address. And I really hope it will be heard by those on whom decision-making depends in the USA.
Завтра Олена виступатиме в Конгресі від імені усіх українських матерів, усіх українських жінок. І це буде важливе звернення.
Could be a long road to a peaceful resolution of the war in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin says Moscow has not seen any desire from Ukraine to fulfill the terms of what he described as a preliminary peace deal agreed to in March. The Russian president was addressing reporters in televised comments after his visit to Iran. He said Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are offering to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. There's been no immediate response from the Ukrainian government to President Putin's remarks. Now, asked about a possible meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky, President Putin said Kyiv had not stuck to the terms of preliminary peace deal. Negotiations took place in March with both sides making proposals, but without a breakthrough. At the time, Zelensky said only a concrete result from the talks could be trusted.
The final result, of course, depends not on the mediators, but on the willingness of the contracting parties to implement the agreements that were reached. Today, we see the powers in Kyiv have no such desire. Initially, we raised the issue of lifting restrictions in such a way that it should be packaged together. Namely, what would assist with exporting Ukrainian grain. We proceed from the fact that all restrictions related to possible supplies of Russian grain for export should be lifted. The restrictions related to supplies of Russian fertilizers to the global market have been removed by the Americans, virtually removed. I hope the same, if they sincerely want to improve the situation on the world food market, I hope the same will happen with supplies of Russian grain for export. Gazprom has always fulfilled, is fulfilling, and intends to fulfill all its obligations And the fact that our partners are to blame, or trying to blame their own mistakes on Russia and Gazprom, it's groundless. Now we are told that we will soon receive this machine from Canada, but Gazprom has yet to receive any official documents on this subject. And of course, we must receive them because this is our property. This is the property of Gazprom. Now we hear all sorts of preposterous ideas about limiting the volume of Russian oil, limiting the price of Russian oil. It's all the same thing that's happening with gas. The result, surprised this is being said by people with higher education, the result will be the same, a rise in prices. Oil prices will skyrocket.
Газпром выполняет, я с этого начал отвечать на ваш вопрос, хочу этим закончить. И будет в полном объеме выполнять свои обязательства, если, конечно, это кому-то нужно.
I want to bring in Dr. Alina Sneger, an expert at the Center for Global Studies Strategy in Ukraine. She joins us from Amsterdam. Dr. Sneger, thank you for joining me this morning. I want to thank you for your patience as well. You're hearing the Russian president talking about Ukraine not being cooperative with the peace deal and making the commitments that he needs to see to be sure that Ukraine really wants an end to this war. What do you make of that?
I will just repeat what we... Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and the possibility to speak with you here. I would just repeat that what we, the Ukrainians and our politicians and our civil society activists were saying all this time, that the existence of Ukraine is not on the negotiation table. So we do not negotiate about our existence, and Russian peace deal, it's not really a peace deal. It's just pure blackmail, and they say that we do not have the right to exist, that Ukrainian identity is not the real, something real, and that the Ukrainian state has to be eliminated. So this cannot be the point of negotiations in any terms. And what Putin has said about so-called, what he estimated, there were some agreements. There were no agreements. There was just Russian terms put on the table, and the Ukrainian side didn't agree with that. That's what I wanted to say about this.
Well, probably the U.S. government agrees with you. Chief National Security spokesperson John Kirby says that the Russian government intends to annex Ukraine, and that speaks to what you're just saying. It does corroborate, what you're saying this morning. He says Russia had said at the beginning of the year, we all saw, it had no intentions of invading Ukraine, and here it was in February doing the same thing. And now it says it does not want to annex the Ukraine, but here it is taking up territories. How do you feel about that?
What we see, well, first of all, I want to say that this war hasn't started on the 24th of February. It has escalated to a full-fledged aggression on the 24th of February. But the real war has started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and with the invasion of Russia to Ukrainian eastern territories and the occupation of Ukrainian eastern territories. So on the 24th of February, we saw that Putin has lost his patience. He was trying to infiltrate in Ukraine Russian agents to control Ukrainian politics, to influence in malign way the Ukrainian existence, Ukrainian society, to stop Ukrainian development as a democratic state and Ukrainian reforms, and he failed. Moscow failed, so he lost his patience and decided to stop Ukrainian existence of Ukrainian state by war means. And that continues still. So Russia lost, but they overestimated. Of course, their possibilities. They intended to conquer Ukraine and in 3 or 4 days, as they declared it from the first like few days of the invasion. But then they failed, and they had to surrender from northern and eastern, like northeast territories. Still, we see that they changed the tactics, and now they're using the tactics of the firewall. That artillery is just shelling the nearby cities and civilian objects and everything like civilian buildings and infrastructure, everything where Russian artillery can reach, and they're just shelling it and destroying it and killing people, and then Russian mercenaries follow. So that's their tactic now, and that's why we need to stop them, because they will not stop. And they, if some leaders and in some countries think that there can be some frozen conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that this war can be frozen, it cannot be frozen actually, and it cannot be frozen because Russia doesn't want to freeze it, because if there is any peace deal about Ukraine, then Russia will just stop for a while, take a break, gather more forces, and then move forward. And they already declare that their next aim is Poland, and that they already declare their main goal to change and to ruin the order, the world order that is now is in the world. Yeah, that those rules that which many countries follow to live in peace in the world. So that's their aim, actually, and they openly declare it. So Ukraine is just the first step.
Wow. Dr. Sneger, I know we're due for a break now, but I just wanted to quickly get your thoughts on what Switzerland said yesterday. They were offered the opportunity to take in wounded Ukrainian citizens, people who had been wounded from the war, and they refused because they said it would make them participatory to the war. And let's talk about the place of neutrality. And some observers have said people need to not be participatory to this war by being neutral. What do you make of that? Do you think it's possible to actually be neutral in this Russian invasion?
For Ukrainian citizens, it is not possible because, as we saw, what we saw in on the occupied territories that were later they were liberated by Ukrainian forces, we saw these mass killings, mass murders of Ukrainian citizens by Russian soldiers, and even those who believed that there can be some negotiations and there can be some coexistence, and at least that the occupiers will not touch civilians, will not touch children and women and elder men. Well, it didn't happen. So many of civilians were killed. So for Russians, actually, even if some people want to be neutral here, Russians do not consider them neutral. That's the problem. That so that's about the Ukrainian citizens. For the rest of the world, it's also like for. Well, maybe if you specify here a question, I can answer you.
Well, I asked about Switzerland, but Alina, I think we get the point you're trying to make, and thank you so much for speaking with us this morning.
Thank you.
When we come back after the break. The U.S. places Welcome back. We'll stay a little longer at the meeting in Iran between presidents of Russia, Turkey and Iran. Turkish President Recep Erdogan said that Kurdish YPG militia is taking steps to divide Syria with foreign support and would benefit the Syrian people to rid the country of them. President Erdogan said he saw his Russian and Iranian counterparts understood Turkey's security concerns, but words are not enough. He says Turkey's battle against the YPG and other militia would continue without a care for who supports it. Ankara has carried out full operations in northern Syria since 2016. Seizing hundreds of kilometers of land and mainly targeting the YPG. President Erdogan says Turkey will again target the YPG, which it regards as a terrorist group, despite opposition from Russia and Iran. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin once again says Russia and Turkey are satisfied with the meeting they held in Istanbul last week, where both sides discussed grain exports via the Black Sea. Russia, Ukraine, Turkey and the United Nations are expected to sign a deal later this week aimed at resuming the shipping of grain from Ukraine across the Black Sea. Putin and Turkey's president held a meeting in Iran earlier yesterday when the president, as the Russian president, said not all the issues have been resolved on the topic, but the fact that there is movement is already good. He also said Russia and Iran had discussed the usage of national currencies in bilateral settlement.
At a bilateral meeting with the Turkish President, Mr. Erdogan, it was stated that Russian-Turkish cooperation is developing dynamically in a whole host of areas. I should note that the issues of food security and cooperation to facilitate the supply of both Russian and Ukrainian grain to world markets were also discussed. At the same time, expressed satisfaction with the meeting held on July 13th on this subject in Istanbul. In a conversation with Iranian President Raisi, specific aspects of bilateral cooperation in the political and economic field were discussed in detail. We paid special attention to strengthening cooperation in energy, industry and transport. We agreed to implement major point projects and to intensify the use of national currencies in direct settlements between our countries.
Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei told Russian President Vladimir Putin Tehran and Moscow need to stay vigilant against Western deception, calling for long-term cooperation between the two countries. Referring to the Ukraine crisis, Khamenei said war is a harsh and difficult event, and Iran is not at all pleased that ordinary people suffer from it, adding that the US dollar should be gradually taken off global trade, and this can be done gradually. President Putin also held talks with his Turkish and Iranian counterparts in what is the Kremlin leader's first trip outside a former Soviet Union since Moscow sent troops into Ukraine on February 24th. It's actually his second meeting outside of Ukraine. Well, that trip also marks President Putin's face-to-face meeting with the NATO leader since the Russian-Ukraine conflict began, with Erdogan part of trilateral talks to discuss a deal aimed at allowing the resumption of Ukraine's Black Sea grain exports, as well as peace in Syria. Always just put up that picture. The U.S. State Department saying 25 million people around the world victims of human trafficking, including many highly vulnerable Ukrainians after Russia's invasion. During the release of its annual report on human trafficking, Secretary of State Antony Blinken honored activists fighting against trafficking, including the president of Ukrainian NGO La Strada, Katrina Cherepaka. The United States report placed Russia on lists of countries engaged in forced labor, in a policy or pattern of human trafficking, forced labor, or whose security forces or government-backed armed groups recruit or use child soldiers. Russia appears frequently throughout the report because of its February 24 invasion of Ukraine and what the documents call the vulnerability to human trafficking of millions of Ukrainian refugees who fled their country.
The scale of this problem is vast. There are nearly 25 million people currently victims of trafficking. 25 million people. The United States is committed to fighting it because trafficking destabilizes societies, it undermines economies, it harms workers, it enriches those who exploit them, it undercuts legitimate business, and most fundamentally, because it is so profoundly wrong. Katerina Cherpaka leads the Ukrainian chapter of the anti-trafficking NGO La Strada. As we all know, since the start of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians have had to flee their homes, some internally within Ukraine, some leaving the country altogether. Many, most, with just what they were able to carry. And that makes them highly vulnerable to exploitation. La Strada has a hotline. It's received an unprecedented number of calls over the past 5 months. The organization has given literally thousands of Ukrainians the information and assistance that they need to try to stay safe as they're forced from their homes. 21 countries were upgraded a tier because those governments made significant increasing efforts to combat trafficking at home as well as for their citizens abroad. 18 countries were downgraded a tier, indicating that they either didn't make significant increasing efforts to combat trafficking, or worse, that their governments have a state-sponsored policy or pattern of trafficking.
We can tell you more now on the attacks by Russian missile strikes on the city of Kramatorsk in Ukraine's east. At least one person was killed there on Tuesday. Governor of the Donetsk region, Pavlo Krylenko, says the attack caused loud explosions and a fire in a residential building. He said the Russians hit the central part of the city, killing at least one civilian. One resident, 70-year-old Valentina, whose son-in-law was seriously wounded, described the attack, saying that she felt a really powerful explosion and she understood it was somewhere in the city. Rescue workers and police were on the scene, helping the residents make their way out of destroyed apartments and providing first aid. The police, however, say there are no military objects in the city, just civilian apartment blocks, debunking Russia's claims of hitting military targets. Russia's ambassador to North Korea has suggested the country's construction workers can be sent to occupied Donbass to help rebuild. Alexander Matsiukora says the North Koreans were highly qualified, hardworking, and ready to work in the most difficult conditions. North Korea recognized the Kremlin-backed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent last week. Pyongyang, the capital city, has previously earned significant foreign exchange from sending its workers overseas, including to Russia, but they were supposed to have been repatriated under a United Nations ruling. Albania and North Macedonia have begun membership talks with the European Union, overcoming a series of obstacles thrown up by EU governments. A start of formal negotiations to allow the two Balkan territories to eventually join the world's largest trading bloc is a breakthrough, but has revealed the EU's lack of appetite for further enlargements, particularly in Northern Europe. Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Albania and North Macedonia have all been promised a place in the EU once they fulfill tough economic, political, military, social and legal reforms. The Belarusian Finance Ministry says Western sanctions have limited Minsk's ability to deal in foreign currencies, which is pushing the country into default despite Minsk being able to service its debt. Belarus did not pay the coupon on its 2027 Eurobond due on June 29th. Minsk had said earlier it was ready to pay the external obligations in the local currency. That's the Belarusian ruble. The ministry said in a statement that creditors were open to working with the issuer to realize their rights, but there are third parties whose actions are definitely aimed at reproducing artificial default phenomena following the general line of the West. Well, about that gas from Russia, President Vladimir Putin says it is the West's own fault. A flow of Russian natural gas to European Union customers has dwindled and warned it could continue ebbing. Speaking to Russian reporters in Tehran after talks with Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and the Turkish President, President Putin said the amount of gas pumped through the Nord Stream pipeline to Germany will fall further from 60 million to 30 million cubic meters a day, or about 1/5 of its capacity, if a turbine is not quickly replaced. The Russian leader also warned the West that its plan to cap the prices of Russian oil as part of its sanctions over Ukraine will destabilize the global oil market and make prices soar. I want to bring in Senior Manager Oil and Gas at and Anderson. Temitope Kolade, he joins us from Lagos. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your patience as well. So first of all, Russia's threat of prices going higher because of those sanctions on Russia by the West. What are we really looking at here?
Well, apparently this is a build-up, and it's getting to a climax that the world is finding difficult to deal with. Like you just said, Putin is also saying that the decline of gas supply to the rest of Europe might continue. Apparently, about some days ago, there was an announcement that there was a need to have some maintenance work on the pipelines that supply gas to Europe, Germany in particular, and beyond. And of course, there are fears that those pipelines may not come back into use, because even before then, the supply of gas to Europe was reduced to about 40%. And of course, we see Europe also doing a lot to ensure that there are contingency plans, there are emergency plans to store up gas and maybe diversify from gas and maybe go back to the fuel that we said they were even dirty before, like coal, right? So it's unfortunate that this is happening at this time, but it's what the world is faced with, and we only can hope that the situation gets better as we watch it play out. But I mean, this is not the best of times for oil and gas.
And gas around the world, that is, not just for those in Ukraine, beg your pardon, those in Europe, which will suffer the consequences. That pipeline you're talking about is supposed to be open tomorrow, but then the Russian president says there's no guarantee the taps will be turned on so that countries which have paid for, which are supposed to receive gas from Russia, would be receiving that. I want to talk about the ruble now. The Iranian religious leader encouraging the Russian president to help replace the dollar. There seems to be, some dispute over, what should be the global currency that should be used in, global trade. Is it possible? Is there any possibility in the near future or in the distant future where, the Russian ruble could become a major player in this?
I don't think so, and I don't think there is anybody that would, any organization that would, for instance, legislate a particular currency for global transactions. I think it's a matter of economics, it's a matter of politics as well, and that's what Russia is currently trying to do to ensure that people pay for gas in rubles, pay for whatever oil that is being supplied by Russia in rubles. But again, it's unlikely that we're going to start having those conversations. You're aware also that in certain parts of the world, for instance, if you go to a part of Africa, there is a central currency that is being used, for instance. Well, it's to ease trade within that region, just like we have euro in the whole of Europe as well. But at the same time, each country wants to exercise some sovereignty, and the more your currency is out there, the stronger your economy is likely to be compared to other economies, which is what Russia is trying to do at the moment. I don't see that happening for Russia, especially given the stance that it's currently taking. Of course, it has its ties, it has its alliances, and they would probably look at what economic gains are in it for them and the ease of exchange for them as well, and consider whether they could pay in rubles. But it could be a major issue, for instance, if you look at how it impacts Europe trading with Russia going forward. And we've been seeing those tiers, those ties basically breaking down over time with Europe. And I think that would continue. And of course, US, for instance, is not in alliance with Russia over this invasion and very many other countries. So I don't see Russia prevailing with rubles over time, except for maybe its allies coming into terms with Russia.
On the horizon, the exports of grains could resume via the Black Sea. Those conversations are going on between the Russian president trying to implore on him to allow Ukrainian grain out of the country so that the world stems a looming food crisis. But in the event, that that doesn't happen, that Russia eventually reneges on its promise to reopen the Black Sea, what could happen and how soon could we be in a food crisis?
Well, I think we're already having it. Even in Nigeria, for instance, there are a couple of those things that we import from Ukraine, and we've been experiencing some scarcity already, especially when we look at our local issues here in Nigeria, for instance, where people are not able to go to farm because of banditry and all of that. There is that danger of food crisis. I cannot say exactly when, but the truth of the matter is that Ukraine supplies a lot of agricultural products across the world. But there are alternatives to that as well. Wheat, for instance, I mean, Ukraine gives us a lot of wheat and maybe some other products, right? So we can only hope that that doesn't happen. But if it then happens, we need to look at alternatives, right? Whether the alternatives would help us deal with the issue for maybe a short term is the issue. We might need to then look at maybe getting people back on farm in very many other places across the world so that at least that part that Ukraine supplies to the world is not altered altogether, and it doesn't have that spiral effect on very many other economies, and of course doesn't loom into that food crisis that we think might happen. I think that there are other nations that would also help cushion that as well. It's not only Ukraine, but again, Ukraine in itself is in deep troubles. Russia in itself is also in trouble because lots of the supplies that it gives to Europe and other nations in terms of gas and oil forms its vital revenue stream. So it's not in the interest of either Ukraine or Russia to continue in this conflict. I think that we're just hoping that there will be some negotiation that will bring things back to some state of normalcy, even though we know we won't get back to that normalcy soonest.
Yeah, that normalcy can only be restored when the war in Ukraine is ended. Thank you so much, Temitope Kolade, for speaking with me.
Thank you, Amarachi. Thanks for having me.
When we come back after the break. Olympic Committee plans to increase budget of aid fund for Ukrainian athletes. That's in sports. Stay with us. Just a little more on the global economy. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister says he saw no shortage of oil in the market, but a lack of oil refining capacity making it necessary to invest more in capacity to produce to process crude oil into various oil products. Global oil prices have surged after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and ensuing sanctions on Russian energy stoked supply concerns. But Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud told reporters in Tokyo after meeting his Japanese counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi that Russia remains an important partner, especially in regard to the stability of the oil market.
As of today, we don't see a lack of oil in the market. There is a lack of refining capacity, which is also an issue. So we need to invest more in refining capacity, and that's a policy decision that countries, especially consuming countries, need to make to ensure that there is enough capacity to refine the oil that is available. Russia is an integral part of OPEC+, and without cooperation in OPEC Plus as a collective, it would be impossible to properly ensure adequate supplies of oil to the international markets and the needs of energy. So
U.S. Treasury Secretary Lieutenant Yellen says Washington will discuss with South Korea measures to limit revenues flowing to Russia, such as price cap on its oil, while the allies work to curb North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. During a speech prepared for a meeting with her South Korean counterpart Chu Kyung-ho, Yellen said the two would explore a price cap to reduce oil earnings and other ways of holding Russia accountable for its war against Ukraine. Just yesterday, she also held separate meetings with a South Korean Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, during which he said the U.S. will impose harsh consequences on countries that break the international economic order, and also had a meeting with the Bank of Korea Governor Ri Chang-yong and a group of women economists. Ms. Yellen told the women entrepreneurs that boosting women's participation in the workforce and giving them more leadership opportunities would boost the economic potential of South Korea and the United States.
The United States and Republic of Korea continue to work in lockstep to limit North Korea's continued development and proliferation of its nuclear and missile programs. Russia's illegal war and the global energy shock that is followed underscores the need to protect ourselves from dependence on foreign oil that makes us vulnerable to the whims of authoritarians like Vladimir Putin.
The Russian Ministry of Defense says Russia has flown 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 strategic bombers over the Arctic as part of training flight. The flight was conducted over the neutral waters of the Arctic Ocean, the Barents Sea. Russia carries out similar training flights over the Arctic, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans, as well as other Black and the Baltic Seas on a regular basis. The ministry says 2 Tupolev Tu-160 aircrafts, which can carry up to 12 short-range nuclear missiles, were in the air for 7 hours and were accompanied by MiG-31 fighter jets. Yesterday, Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense ministry spokesperson, announced that Russian forces have destroyed ammunition depots in the southern Odessa region and were storing weapons supplied to Kyiv by the United States and the European countries. He, however, did not say how many depots are destroyed or what weapons were being destroyed there. In the meantime, Ukraine continues to train new civilian volunteers to help fight against Russian forces as the country claims to have a total of 1 million in its armed forces and aims to recapture the Russian-controlled south regions. A group of civilian volunteers have recently joined Ukraine's territorial defense, which is operating together with the army against Russia. During a regular training day in the forest near Bucha, these volunteer fighters are going through the ambush training. Surprisingly, surprising Russians from behind in order to neutralize their commanders has proven effective so far. The training required for this, however, had to be drastically cut short. A significant part of this alleged 1 million fighters is already involved in defending the remaining Donbas territory and could be used in any counter-offensive. Nevertheless, the country's military is optimistic of a win in this war. Sports news now. The International Olympic Committee, the IOC, is planning to increase the budget of the aid fund for Ukrainian athletes from $2.5 million to $7.5 million. IOC President Thomas Bach said the Olympic body is committed to strengthen its support for Ukrainian athletes with a special view to the Paris 2024 Olympic Games and the 2026 Milan Winter Olympic Games. More than 100,000 athletes are unable to train, and a number of sports facilities have been destroyed since Russia invaded Ukraine in late February. Russian tennis stars Andrei Rublev and Daria Kasatkina have revealed they may consider changing their citizenship as their home country remains largely frozen out of international sports due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Rublev and Kasatkina, ranked 8th and 12th in the men's and women's world rankings, are allowed to compete on the tennis circuit as neutrals. Rublev, who claimed Olympic mixed doubles gold when representing the Russian Olympic Committee at Tokyo 2020, suggested that he might be forced to switch allegiance. Kasatkina joined Rublev in admitting that she would consider signing up for a different citizenship as she called for an end to the war in Ukraine. And as we end the program, members of the Ukrainian Army's mobile tank repair unit are always on the move as they travel along the Donbas front line in the country's east, responding to radio calls from battle groups requesting regular maintenance, quick fix or breakdown recovery. And mechanics move in an armored personnel carrier to fix the vehicle on the spot or tow it away for more serious repairs. 23-year-old Saeed Serhi, a mechanic and driver of the recovery vehicle, says that they're like nomads and move from place to place. Another serviceman said he began serving in the unit around his hometown in Shinaev, a town in northern Ukraine of around 285,000 people, before the conflict that was heavily shelled in the earlier days in the war. And that's the program this morning. We'll have updates at 5. I'm Amarachi Ubani.